say what is needed to resolve the problem.
It's now my immense pleasure to introduce Stefano Boeri, who will introduce our next speakers, Nicola Setari and Paul Dujardin. Paul Dujardin and Nicola Setari. However, I would like to introduce Stefano because he will introduce this whole next section, which is a section about tomorrow. You all know Stefano as an architect, an urbanist, and author and writer. There are so many parallel realities to his work. Stefano is a great inspiration for this pavilion, for Lorenza, Baroncelli, and me, and everybody else who worked on it. And we are extremely honored and happy to launch here in Venice a project which had a previous chapter in the Berlin Biennale with Juan Gaetan last week, which is the project of Tomorrow, which is a new adventure involving many authors and writers from all over the world. So Stefano will now introduce the whole project. He will then introduce the speakers, and we will then have a whole series of intervention. We have Amos Gitai, Alessandro Bava, Rem Koolhaas. A very, very warm welcome to Stefano Boeri.
Thank you so much, Hans. So, thank you for hosting here in the Swiss Pavilion. I think in a way all this started more or less 13 years ago in Kitakyushu in Japan, and we will explain you in a few moments why. So we are now launching a web platform that we are now going to describe. We are a group based in Milano, per Paolo Tamborelli, Lorenza Baroncelli, Maddalena Bregani, Tommaso Sacchi, and me, with Folder as the directors. But we are a part of a network of promoters, and so we are here also with Hans-Ulrich, with Rem, with Gianluigi Recuperato, with Joseph Grima, who I think is here, and who is representing also one of the two main promoters of the web platform, which is Matera Capitale della Cultura 2013, and greetings to Paolo Verri, who I think is around. And the other subject, the other 2019, sorry, 13 has passed, 19, and the other subject who is very important for us is the representation of the European Commission in Italy, and Roberta Talarico is here with us, and we are starting to launch a web platform who wants to bridge a gap between, let me say, different languages and disciplines. And the idea is to have a conversation which is in a way public because exposed, so everybody could follow this, but not open to everybody. So it's a different way to start with a conversation who, in a way, go back to the concept of Republic of Letters. But before entering in the point, I'd love to introduce the two first hosts of this afternoon, Paul Dujardin and Nicola Setari. I think that it's very important that we have Paul and Nicola here because, as you probably know, 2 years ago, the European Parliament launched the idea of a roundtable on a new narrative for Europe. And I was involved recently in this sequence of table round that were gathering a bunch of thinkers from all over Europe. And I think that this question, so what is Europe nowadays? How can we narrate the future of Europe? What's the blurring identity of this continent? It's part of what we started to discuss with the Tomorrow, and it's part of a question that is, let me say, shared by all of us, and was in a way also problematically questioned by the next European election 2 weeks ago. So, Paul and Nicola, I give you the stage. Just to remind, Paul Dujardin is the director of Bozar Center for Fine Art in Brussels. He's a Belgian art historian. And Nicola Setari is an Italian curated editor, but based in Brussels, who has done a very important thing, but for instance, created the Visionary Africa platform for Bozar recently. So, Nicola and Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano, for this introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon to give you this brief presentation of the project, The New Narrative for Europe. Imagine there's a lot of expectation also for those that will follow us in the interventions today, but we're here to share with you a project that Stefano has begun to speak about and that we are presenting at the Arsenale in the Corderie. So to give perhaps a starting remark, a bit ironical also, of what the New Narrative for Europe is as a project. I heard earlier conversations about concrete utopia and the way in which we can bridge the gap between reality and utopia. Well, I would define the New Narrative for Europe project an attempt to bring together Niccolò Machiavelli's Prince with Thomas More's Utopia. What I mean by that is that we are all aware that there is a sort of a general lack of understanding of how the logic of politics is dealt with at the European level. What are the rules? How is the system set up? There's a considerable degree of confusion at that level. Also, just to talk about it. So the New Narrative is a sort of exploration into trying to understand these logics of power and also of regulation and of law. And in this sense, it kind of refers to the tradition of the Prince, of Machiavelli's Prince. On the other hand, we also are trying, of course, to bring the legacy and the attention and inspiration that art and science has towards building alternative systems and more sustainable and humane systems. So one could understand the project as a platform that brings together artists, writers, and scientists with political leaders at the European and at the national level. It's a platform that has been traveling in different cities in Europe. It started last year in April in Brussels at the Center for Fine Arts. I'm here with Paul Dujardin, as you've heard already, the director of the Center for Fine Arts, which is an institution, a cultural institution positioned on the border, really, between the world of politics, the European world of politics with its institutions, and with the cultural world, of course, that it on a daily basis stages and presents in Europe. I think it's also quite singular, at least to mention, we're very grateful for the possibility of presenting the project here at the Swiss Pavilion, and also to Hans-Ulrich Obrist to be able to do it in this marathon. One can understand the legacy of the project as a virus, really, as an attempt also to infiltrate the European institutions with a different mindset, or one could say vision, language, and set of actions that are being proposed by the artists involved so far. So it's the viral aspect of it is quite important. You will find at the Arsenale a declaration, which is sort of the first result of the project, which is called The Mind and Body of Europe, and which we are here also to disseminate. Now, I would probably start with a question to kind of give a sense of more in depth of what the project is about, and to connect also to some of the themes that are being dealt with here in the biennial by Rem Koolhaas with his curatorial project. And I guess there's a considerable attention towards the idea of the crisis of national identities as being sort of a reality today, and a reality also of the crisis of modernity. And we, within the New Narrative for Europe project, there seems to be a very strong shift of focus from the question of European identity to the question of what is the European imaginary. So Paul, I would like you maybe to explain better why it is so important to make this shift from the question of identity to imaginary within the project.
Yes, Nicola, I think that first we saw it with the last elections between these problem of identity for the most of the people in European, I would say, in common ground, the national borders, even in the discussion we had in the Biennale between national borders and a more global European vision and integration, it's still too limited to these national identities. What's the problem of populism and political reality of these days? And we saw it from the political side, even avoiding this discussion in Parliament about a common, I would say, European imaginary, and also limited themselves only on the economic and political language in a certain way. So there is, in a certain necessity of this discussion we started, who could seem as a form of propaganda. What wasn't the real question, because there was a form of skepticism from most of the artists and intellectuals to bring this gap. But at the same time, we saw for the last decades that Biennale of Venice, of many other cultural projects were already in this European imaginary language. Even in media, we were feeling to go across these borders. So this discussion is absolutely necessary, was feeling in the first place with a certain form of negative, but also at the same time, this constructive skepticism, discussion was a very important result of all the discussion we had the last year.
So also the European imaginary understood as the insistent on the perception that there is a lack in public debate of focus on culture as an instrument of soft power in Europe as well. So there is you were saying the European candidates, for example, to the presidency were lacking any focus and attention to the arts. But so in what way is the project, I mean, is the project about lobbying for the arts at the European level? Is that what the new narrative for Europe is about? Or is the take at a different, playing out at a different level?
First, globally, I think that there's a form of analphabetism from both sides, I would say, from the artists and intellectuals in this discussion, having not really language in this whole debate, and from the side of the political body. If we were looking the last 3 weeks, all the major parties, even independent of the populist parties, the cultural debate was never there. So the soft power of this discussion and the bridge of discussion between artists and politicians, what we tried to do the last year, and even we brought the politicians in the hall and bringing the artists on the stage. The exercise is only a beginning of the exercise than a final discussion we had the last year.
So what is happening here in Venice? What is exactly the kind of the project? How is it presented in Venice, and why did you decide to bring it here?
But firstly, I think we came out with a declaration, and it's, as a document, there was a necessity to have a communication, so to launch a wheel together with the Tomorrow project, together to have in this, I would say, digital world, to have a discussion who is not limited to an in-crowd, to a limited number of people, but to enlarge, I would say, this discussion even to round tables, even with politicians. So we will have Barroso coming to Venice at the beginning of September. And I think that, I believe that that's more a very subtle way of communication. It's more than, I would say, the room of the space together with Tomorrow you have to visit is this interdisciplinary space where also Rem Koolhaas wanted to have this interconnection in the space we were gathering. So it's a way of discussing and posing questions. No, it's not. It's an open debate with a participation as all the visitors of the Biennale of Venice.
Mm-hmm. But what is the core of the declaration? I mean, what would you say, just because everybody now is probably wondering how this strange alien of the European Commission has landed here at the Venice Biennial? What would you say is the core of the statement of the declaration?
Globally, culture and science, what essentially are vital forms globally of the nourishment of the European political body. It's that the reason of, it's a state of mind, what we wanted to declare in this whole discussion.
So it's a series of statements around the role of culture in politics at the European level today.
Yes, and giving an open discussion. So it's a start of discussion and not to limit ourselves.
And I guess a question which follows, I mean, coming back to the point on the imaginary and the image deficit, because there's sort of a general awareness that Europe today has a lack of representation of images with which to identify. What would you say is really the role of artists and intellectuals at that level? Isn't there some kind of instrumentalization, or as I mean, you were mentioning earlier on, propaganda as a risk or perception of the project? In what way can artists get involved in a way that is not instrumental in the project?
But globally,
and not only artists, institutions like a biennial or...
Yeah, but the imaginary global space is certainly not limited to space of the European Union. It's much larger than that. It's globally I would say the common ground of what's Europe today, from Istanbul to Moscow. It's really the European Council. It's more than 28 countries. It's the cosmopolitan area from what would be the Manifesta in the Hermitage in the coming 2 weeks, as the next Biennale will be in Istanbul together with the former curator of Documenta, who will be invited there. So it's a much larger debate than the limited space of a political body of the European Union.
But who are some of the artists that have, I mean, could you elaborate a bit more on what concrete contributions artists have been bringing to the conversation?
But most of the artists who were involved, even by a form of skepticism in the beginning, and I would say artists from different generations and from all over Europe, even not from the Western Europe perspective, but a larger sense of Europe, like Giorgio Conrad, about the tragedies of the 20th century, and as Michelangelo Pistoletto, discussing this form of responsibility. You know, the politics is something very exclusive, where we have the culture field and people as Michelangelo Pistoletto since the 60s in a much more inclusive way, respecting the position of the other artists. And so, or Olafur Eliasson, we met last year in Venice, between his way of approach, not only on the debate, but also on a way of acting, participating. And for him, this narrative of Europe is by the production of artwork. So the reality of this work. So that's a way of doing by the arts, and this narrative is the best way by what we have in filmmakers, by all the topics of crisis, identity, migration, problems, where we can bring this gap as a reality.
And maybe the last question, as time is running short. What would you say, you mentioned Olafur's work, but what would you say is a concrete example of a new narrative for Europe in the making today?
But what's coming to my mind is a certain global project, certainly here in the Biennale with REM choices of forms, by a form of interdisciplinarity, but a real form of interdisciplinarity, not what was maybe always a tradition is the viaduct of Millau. We could give an example as some form of the ideal form from what is design, architecture, art for the 21st century, where even a French construction company was working together with Belgian engineers, Foster as an architect. Is a way of, I would say, the sublime in the narrative. And that's what we need to bring in this acting. Most of the artists are really finding the necessity to act and to make really statements. And I think that's the way architecture and is what must be more than these national identities, or was the questioning of this Biennale?
Okay, thank you, Paul. Our time's run out. I can only invite you all to visit the Arsenale and gather our material and join the conversation. New narrative for Europe, and hope this was not too much information, too much short time, but we tried to do our best to stay within the format of the marathon. Thank you, and have a great stay at the Biennial.